I've seen the way that Christians have approached a lot of things, and I kind of realized that I had sort of developed some ideas about, I've got advice for Christians ultimately, I think is what it is. Like, if you've got people like me who are currently in the flock, and you want to keep them there, I think there's some things that you could do differently.
How dare you, Rhett? As if leaving Christianity behind was not enough, now you want to tell Christians how to be better Christians? That sounds arrogant. It sounds condescending. And to many believers, it probably sounds exactly like the kind of atheist posturing they already resent. But honestly, I get the impulse. I understand why someone like Rhett would want to say, if you want to keep people like me in the church, here are some things you may need to rethink. That feeling makes sense to me. What I wish, though, is that he had framed it differently, because right now, a lot of Christian apologists are reacting more to the tone they think they heard than to the substance of what he is actually saying. And that is what this video is about. I want to take broadly the same message and present it in a way that is less likely to trigger that defensive reaction. Not because Christians should never feel challenged, but because I want the argument itself to get a fair hearing. Of course, I cannot guarantee that no Christian will be offended. That would be unrealistic. But I do want to make one thing clear from the start. I'm not approaching this from the angle that I'm smarter, more rational, or more enlightened than those stupid Christians. To be fair, I do not think Rhett or Alex were necessarily coming from that angle either, but I can see how some Christians would hear it that way. So with that said, let's begin.
I see it as sort of 3 points. I would say they need to embrace faith, they need to embrace truth, and they need to embrace Jesus.
I do not have many comments on the second and the third point, so this video will focus mainly on the first one, faith. Rhett's basic point is that Christianity has traditionally been a religion of faith. You believe not because you have objective, publicly verifiable proof, but because you trust. He appeals to passages like Hebrews 11, where faith is described as the certainty of things hoped for, the proof of things not seen. And John 20, where Jesus says, "Blessed are those who believe without seeing." And honestly, I think Rhett is largely right about that. For most of Christian history, faith was not primarily centered on rigorous evidential demonstration in the way modern apologetics often presents it today. That does not mean Christians in the past had no reasons, no arguments, or no intellectual tradition. Of course they did, but Christianity was not mainly sold to ordinary believers as something you first establish through modern standards of historical analysis, empirical verification, or critical inquiry. It was a faith commitment, a spiritual commitment, a trust-based commitment. And I think that is still true for most Christians today. Hello, my friends. This is Shane from Mindful Living. Thank you for tuning in. I'm a former Christian and a former pastor. And on this channel, I take a critical look at religious issues. I care about these topics not just because I find religion interesting, but because religion has a real impact on people's lives and on the world around us. If that kind of conversation interests you, please subscribe. It really helps the channel. Now, only a relatively small number of believers come to faith through sustained intellectual investigation into whether the evidence really supports the Bible's truth claims. For most people, becoming Christian is not the end result of a careful evidential process. It is shaped more by upbringing, community, personal experience, existential need, spiritual longing, or a sense of conviction. Here's how Rhett put it.
I saw a lot of people come to know Jesus during my time in ministry, and I never, not once, after sharing the gospel, did I have someone say, "Do you have any way to prove that that's true? Is there something I can read to know that the Bible is true?" It was like, no, it was a faith decision. It was a spiritual decision.
I think that observation is important. Rhett then argues that modern Christian apologetics often tries to shift the paradigm. Instead of saying Christianity is fundamentally about faith, it increasingly tries to frame itself as something supported by reason and evidence, especially when it comes to claims like the resurrection of Jesus. But this is where the problem begins. Once Christians try to defend the resurrection as if it can meet the kinds of evidential standards people associate with modern critical inquiry, the case becomes much weaker than apologists often suggest. We simply do not have the kind of evidence that would justify the level of confidence many of them claim. We are dealing with ancient texts, theological narratives, sparse sources, and an extraordinary miracle claim that cannot be independently verified. So I think Rhett's point here is basically this. If Christianity wants to present itself as a faith tradition, then fine, say that honestly. But if it wants to present itself as something that can be demonstrated with strong objective evidence in a modern sense, then that case falls far short of what many apologists pretend. That, I think, is the tension he's getting at.
Ultimately, what I'm asking for, I think, is just embrace the fact that it's a faith. And if you're saying that you believe this in faith because you trust God, and then there's a legitimate spiritual transformation that takes place, why is that not a good enough argument? Why do we have to get into using reason and logic? Because for me, I was told it was true because it was reasonable. When I found out it wasn't reasonable, I concluded that it wasn't true.
I totally agree with that. In fact, I think this is one of the main reasons so many Christians become former Christians today. They were told that Christianity rests on solid, verifiable evidence. They were taught that the claims were not just spiritually meaningful, but intellectually compelling in a strong, objective sense. And when they later discovered that the case was much weaker than they had been led to believe, many of them walked away. Now, I'm going to get to the part where I disagree in a moment. But before that, let me show you a clip of Alex O'Connor making a very similar point.
If somebody becomes convinced that the arguments they heard from an apologist that made them think about Christianity actually aren't as well founded, if that's what brought them into the church, then that's what will send them right out again. It's the same hand that leads you in also pulls you out. Okay, and so in that case, is it not better to ground Christianity in what historically people have claimed is the most sort of important part about your relationship with God, which is the experience, the faith, the sort of personal commitment to a relationship with Jesus, that kind of stuff.
And again, I agree with that too. My wife said to me some time ago that she never understood why apologists had to make the whole thing so complicated. The Bible tells Christians to have faith like children, to trust God, to pray, to gather with other believers, and to live according to God's teachings. That was enough for her. She was not interested in whether Josephus mentioned James or whether some historical detail made the resurrection slightly more probable. That was not what sustained her faith. What mattered to her was prayer, church, moral practice, meaning, trust, and the hope that her life was in God's hand. It was not a matter of historical argument. It was a matter of faith. So yes, I understand the point Rhett and Alex are making here, and I think they are right to identify this tension. But here is where something about their advice still rubs me the wrong way. And the title of the video does not help at all. We need to save Christianity from Christians. That title makes me cringe. I'm not saying I'm personally offended by it, but if I were still a committed Christian, I can easily imagine feeling a bit defensive. And the reason is not hard to see. When former Christians tell believers how Christianity should be practiced while having no intention of practicing it themselves, it can easily come across the wrong way. Even if the criticism is partly correct, the tone can sound patronizing. It can sound like this: I care about truth, but since you people apparently cannot handle that, here is the softer version of Christianity you should settle for instead. Now, I do not think that is what Rhett and Alex actually mean. I do not think that they are trying to talk down to Christians in that way, but I do think that is how some believers will hear it. So let me try to offer a different angle, one that still captures the substance of what they are saying, but without quite as much edge. Instead of framing these ideas as advice, I would present them differently. I would say, here are the options Christians could take, and here are the consequences I think comes with those options. So what I'm offering is not advice, but information. What Christians do with that information is up to them. I would hesitate to call it advice because I am not following that path myself. When I give Christians advice in my videos, it is usually because I actually practice what I'm recommending. If I do not agree with a certain approach strongly enough to live by it myself, then I'm not going to turn around and advise Christians to adopt it. That said, I do think the option Rhett and Alex lay out could be a legitimate one, but some caveats need to be stated clearly. And to be fair, I suspect Rhett and Alex understand this already. They just did not spell it out carefully enough. First, if Christians, or anyone else for that matter, believe something primarily on faith rather than evidence, then they should not expect other people to agree with them simply because they do. If your belief rests on faith, then you cannot assume that others should share that faith, especially when they do not have the same experiences, upbringing, or spiritual inclinations that you do. In other words, once Christians follow Rhett's suggestion and step back from the language of evidence, proof, and objective demonstration, and instead place the emphasis on faith, they can no longer speak as if Christianity has been shown to be objectively true in a way that others should recognize. At that point, the faith becomes something more personal, more internal, and less universally binding in its justification. So they cannot consistently say, I believe Christianity because it has been shown to be objectively true. What they can say is something more like this. I believe because this faith gives meaning to my life. I believe because it resonates with me. I believe because this way of life transforms me. Those are very different kinds of claims. And if Christians want to move in that direction, then I think they need to know not just what they gain, but also what they should give up. Theo Allison is a very good example of someone who illustrates this line of thinking well. He has said that secular people or atheists are perfectly justified in not believing in the resurrection because given their worldview, rejecting that claim can be entirely reasonable.
For me, belief in the resurrection is part of a larger worldview, and it itself does not establish that worldview, but fits or does not fit within that worldview. It fits within mine. I am happy to say that I don't believe any of the skeptical hypotheses, and the one I put in my book I deem to be improbable. But again, if I'm playing devil's advocate and speaking from the point of view of somebody who knows that miracles don't happen and that natural law governs everything, then that person is not irrational, given that presupposition, to think that, let's say, thieves stole the body and Mary Magdalene hallucinated and a couple of other things happened and that got the ball rolling.
I agree with Theo Allison, and I would go one step further. Even for people who hold a theistic worldview, but not necessarily a Christian one, it can still be perfectly reasonable to reject the Christian resurrection claim, even if they believe miracles are possible in principle. Take Judaism, for example. Jews are not naturalists. They are not committed to the idea that miracles are impossible. And yet, Judaism, as a religious tradition, does not accept that Jesus rose from the dead in the way Christians claim, or that he was vindicated as the Messiah through resurrection. Jewish thinkers can reject those claims for specifically theological reasons, such as Jesus failing to fulfill their messianic expectations. But they can also appeal to many of the same considerations that atheists appeal to. They can question the reliability of the gospel accounts. They can suggest that the disciples experienced visions, hallucinations, grief-induced interpretations, or legendary development. In other words, they do not need to deny the possibility of miracles in order to remain unconvinced by the Christian case. And that is the key point. If both atheists and non-Christian theists can reasonably reject the resurrection on the basis of the available evidence, then the evidential case is clearly not as compelling or as universal as apologists often make it sound. Even among people who are open to the supernatural, the resurrection does not force belief. So if we are talking about evidence rather than prior commitment, both theists and atheists can still reasonably conclude that the case for Jesus' resurrection is simply not strong enough to carry the weight apologists place on it. Before my Christian viewers rush to object in the comments, I would ask that you first watch my other videos on the resurrection of Jesus. I will leave links in the description. This video is not mainly a critique of miracle claims, so I'm not going to go deeply into that issue here. But here's the point. Once Christians adopt the approach Rhett and Alex are suggesting, they can no longer easily say that disbelief is a moral failure in the same way, or that it clearly deserves divine punishment, and that creates a serious theological problem, because the Bible plainly presents unbelief as a grave offense before God, one that invites judgment and wrath. Now, Christians understandably do not want to say that God punishes people unfairly, so they need some explanation for why unbelievers are genuinely blameworthy. Historically, one common response has been to say that non-believers are not innocent doubters. They are willfully resisting what God has already made evident to them. They are not rejecting Christianity because the evidence is lacking, but because they are stubborn, rebellious, or morally resistant. That is especially the logic of Romans 1. People are said to be without excuse. Why? Because God has supposedly made himself sufficiently known, and yet they suppress that truth. But once Christians start admitting that external evidence is not central, that faith does not rest on strong public proof, and that the resurrection cannot really be established in the way apologists often claim, then the situation changes. Yes, one problem goes away. At that point, the atheist objection that there's insufficient evidence no longer lands in quite the same way, because the Christian can simply respond, I know the evidence is not sufficient in that sense, but Christianity was never primarily about that kind of proof to begin with. Okay, but that move creates another problem. If Christians admit that the evidence is not strong enough to compel belief, and that faith is not based on publicly demonstrable proof, then they also have to admit that non-Christians may have perfectly understandable reasons for remaining unconvinced. And once you admit that, it becomes much harder to explain why God would be justified in condemning them for unbelief. That is the tension. So adopting this mindset is not nearly as simple as Rhett and Alex make it sound. It does solve one apologetic problem, but only by creating a deeper theological one. And I think that is part of the reason their video hits such a nerve with many Christians. The second caveat that I think needs to be made explicit is this. Once Christians take Rhett's advice and ground their religion primarily in faith rather than evidence, they lose much of their ability to distinguish Christianity from other forms of superstition or a non-evidential belief on rational grounds. Now, what do I mean by superstition? I mean belief or practice that is not grounded in solid evidence, but is maintained because it feels meaningful, comforting, protective, or psychologically helpful. By that definition, a person can have faith in Christianity, but a person can also have faith in horoscopes, tarot, lucky charms, omens, folk rituals, or any number of spiritual traditions. And once evidence is no longer required to justify Christian belief, it becomes much harder to explain why Christianity is legitimate, but those other beliefs are not. That does not mean all superstitions are necessarily harmful. Some are harmless. Some are even kind of amusing. For example, I come from Taiwan, home of the world's leading semiconductor industry. You might assume that engineers working in chip manufacturing would be especially secular or resistant to this kind of thing. Not necessarily. One well-known practice is placing a specific kind of puffed corn snack called guai guai near machines or electronics as a gesture for good fortune, so the equipment will behave and keep running smoothly. The joke, or maybe not entirely a joke, is that the name of the snack sounds like behave well. Even the expired bag is supposed to be replaced. Now, if you ask whether there is any serious evidence that a bag of snack improves machine performance, of course the answer is no. Nobody expects a rigorous study to show a statistically significant effect, but people still do it. Why? Because the cost is tiny, the ritual is simple, and there is always that little thought in the back of the mind. What if it helps? That is how superstition often works. It survives not because people have strong evidence for it, but because human beings are emotional creatures, not just rational ones. Our emotions do not always move in step with reason. When we feel anxious, uncertain, or vulnerable, ritualized behavior can calm us down, give us a sense of control, and help regulate our emotions. Take something as simple as carrying a charm into a job interview. You may not literally believe the charm has magical power. Your rational mind may tell you it does nothing. But if the gesture reduces your anxiety, helps you focus, or gives you a little boost of confidence, then it can still have a real psychological effect. And that is exactly the problem. Once Christians say that evidence is not central and not faith itself is enough, then Christianity starts to occupy the same general category as many other beliefs and practices that people hold, not because they are well supported, but because they are emotionally meaningful, identity forming, comforting, or existentially useful. Now, Christians may say that their faith is deeper, richer, or more transformative than superstition. Fine, but still, that is no longer the same thing as saying it is more evidentially justified. And that distinction matters. As long as people do not present these superstitious ideas or rituals as universal truths, and as long as they are not trying to prop them up with pseudoscience, they can still produce net social benefits. They can comfort people, reduce anxiety, create a sense of ritual, and in some cases even make life feel a little lighter or more meaningful. But that is exactly where Rhett's advice creates problems for Christians, especially evangelicals. If evangelicals want to maintain that they possess the truth, or the truth with the capital T, then they are not going to be comfortable saying that their religion is fundamentally grounded in faith rather than robust rational inquiry. They cannot easily say that their beliefs are simply one among many ways human beings cope with uncertainty, regulate emotions, or add meaning and structure to life. They cannot reduce Christianity to a psychologically useful framework or a set of comforting rituals because the religion itself makes much larger claims than that. This is especially true of exclusivist monotheistic religion. If you believe there's only one true God, that your religion alone gives the correct account of reality, and that rival religions are false, then you need some way to justify that exclusivity. And that becomes much harder to do once you admit that there's not much external evidence to support your view in a way that clearly separates it from all the others. That is why this move is much harder for Christians than atheists sometimes realize. We as atheists can casually suggest that Christians stop obsessing over evidence and go back to focusing on faith, but we should not expect that suggestion to be attractive to them, especially when we do not follow that path ourselves. From their perspective, that move comes at a very high cost. It forces them to give up much of the intellectual framework they have used to defend the uniqueness and truth of their religion. And that is why Rhett and Alex's proposal, even if it has some appeal, is not nearly as simple or painless as it may sound. And this leads to my third caveat. If Christians take Rhett's advice seriously, then they are no longer standing on solid ground when it comes to judging what counts as orthodoxy and what counts as heterodoxy. They lose much of the basis for declaring that the Latter-day Saints are heretics. They also lose much of the basis for saying that second-century Gnostics represented a corruption of the Christian faith. Because if belief is no longer grounded in anything objective, then Orthodox Christianity itself is no longer grounded in anything objective either. Now, I'm not saying that calling other people heretics is a good thing. My point is that Christians would understandably hesitate to give up that right. If they want to preserve a distinct Christian identity, then there has to be some clear boundary around what counts as Christian belief and what does not. For many Eastern religious traditions, it is not especially difficult to say that there are multiple paths towards spirituality, and that enlightenment may look different from one person to another. There is often much less anxiety about policing doctrinal purity. But for monotheistic religions like Christianity, orthodoxy matters a great deal. And no matter how you frame it, evidence still plays some role in distinguishing correct doctrine from false doctrine. For Christians to insist that the Jews were wrong about Jesus, there has to be at least some evidential basis for claiming that the resurrection really happened in history. They cannot simply say, I have faith that Jesus rose from the dead, therefore the Jews were wrong. That is not going to work. Now, I understand Rhett's broader point. He's saying that Christians should stop pretending that science is on their side when it really is not. If they keep insisting on the evidential route, they are ultimately going to fail. And if they do manage to convince people that way, that may be even worse, because it means those people were persuaded by bad reasoning or pseudoscience. I agree with that larger point. Still, I think it comes across as condescending when Rhett and Alex say they want to rescue Christianity from Christians. That posture is not likely to work. I would frame it differently. I would say that Christians have a few options. They can try to make their religion as evidence-based as possible, but that also opens the door to evidence-based scrutiny. And no matter how you spin it, the evidence does not show that miracles happen today, much less that one definitely happened 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine. At best, this route may serve as reassurance for believers themselves, but it does not carry much weight in serious academic inquiry. Or they can make Christianity more about spiritual experience and faith. That kind of belief cannot be proven by science, but neither can it be disproven by science. The trade-off, however, is that Christians then lose the ability to say their religion is grounded in reason in any robust sense, and they also lose much of their basis for confidently declaring other religions false. There is no perfect solution here, but Christians should not expect to have it both ways. They should not expect to appeal to material evidence when it seems helpful, and then dismiss the importance of material evidence when it no longer supports what they want to believe. What this means is that Christians cannot avoid the need for consistency. If they want to keep talking about orthodoxy, heresy, and false doctrine, then faith alone is not enough. They need some basis for saying why their version of Christianity is true and why rival versions are not. Otherwise, orthodoxy starts to look less like truth and more like tradition backed by historical dominance. So if I were to offer any advice at all, it would be this. Be consistent. That is the standard I try to hold myself to, and it is the standard I think everyone should be willing to face. You do not need to become an ex-Christian to watch my videos. I am not here to manufacture the conversions, but I am here to challenge people, including myself, to think more carefully and live more consistently with the beliefs they claim to hold. That challenge applies to Christians, non-Christians, and former Christians alike. So what do you think? Did Alex and Rhett get this right? Or do you think they overlooked some important costs? And what do you think of my take? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.